Tonight we have the special privilege and treat of welcoming our newest board member, Kaleb Schrock. He's our presenter tonight. Kaleb was originally from Waverly, Iowa, and he came to study Spanish and marketing at Northwestern College. He then received employment working for Northwestern College's advancement department right after college and has lived in Orange City since. He's been taking classes to fulfill a history degree at Northwestern and has been reenacting the Rocky Mountain fur trade era for the past 10 years. In the last 3 years, he began really delving into his research and study about the era. He and his wife are into hiking and camping and enjoy traveling around the world. They are currently expecting twin girls in the middle of July, so congratulations. Kaleb will present his perspective on the mountain man's impact on westward expansion after the Louisiana Purchase, when mountain men would go to fuel the fur hat trade. Kaleb is dressed in authentic mountain man attire, which he sourced himself, as well as showing us a mock-up of a fur trader's campsite. Now we'll go back in time and consider the lives of famous mountain men like Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, John Coulter, Jedediah Smith, Hugh Glass, James Beckworth, and our very own Kaleb Schrock.
How are we all doing tonight? Good. Now then, I suppose you're all here to learn a bit more about the Rocky Mountain fur trade, is that right? Was that mine? Thanks. All right. Well, as the sign says, my name's Kaleb Schrock, and I really appreciate the very flattering introduction I received from Al there. All of it was lies. So, Generation of Venture, the Mountain Men. Not a lot is known, if you think about it, about the mountain men from a modern day perspective. A lot of people think of it from the Hollywood, the Revenant, Jeremiah Johnson, that kind of stuff. But for me, the mountain men is more than that. It's more than just the flashy wandering up in the mountains. For me, it's about getting out close to nature, experiencing what they experience, and seeing firsthand what it was really like for them out in the wilderness. So, let's talk a little bit more about reenacting the mountain men. Trappers, traders, explorers, hunters. These are just a few of the words that describe the mountain men of the 1820s and 1830s. While the fur trade was centuries old by the turn of the 19th century, the Rocky Mountain fur trade lasted only for a generation, for about 15 years. Now, I've spent the last 10 years reenacting the fur trade with my grandfather, so I've only got about 5 years left of being able to do it. And if you're ever interested in experiencing a modern day rendezvous, there's another one, this picture actually being from that rendezvous. We're hosting a modern day rendezvous in Cherokee, Iowa. So if you're interested, they have them in the fall and spring. So that's a picture of my grandfather and I at the Cherokee Ridge Runners Rendezvous. Now, in the last 4 years, last 3-4 years, like Al said, I've really delved into learning what everyday life really was like for the mountain men up in the mountains. So, we do a little thing what we like to call experimental archaeology. Now, what is experimental archaeology? Think about it this way. We read journals written by mountain men years ago, and they write about their day-to-day lives. They did this. But what are the things you don't write down in your journal today? You don't write about how you brush your teeth. Things like that. They don't write about how they started a fire. They don't talk, this is exactly how you take your flint, and this is exactly how you take your steel and start your flint and steel fire. They don't write it. They assume you know that. They assume you know how to brush your teeth. So experimental archaeology is people like me getting dressed in the funny clothes, using the funny equipment, and kind of going back in time and trying out the equipment, learning firsthand what it was like to use that stuff and relearn some of those skills that people took for granted in the early 1800s. Now, I'm going to start off by talking about a mountain man that many of you may have heard of, that being Hugh Glass. Now, Hugh Glass was made famous by the book Lord Grizzly by Fred Manfred, and more recently the movie The Revenant. Now, Hugh Glass was a real mountain man, and has a real story of perseverance, determination, and grit. Little is known about Glass before the incident, and many believe that he was born in Pennsylvania in 1783. Now, some more speculation about what he did before becoming a Rocky Mountain fur trapper was he was a sailor for a time, where according to some stories, he was captured by pirate captain Jean Lafitte and forced to be a pirate for a time, before he escaped off the coast of Texas and found his way up to St. Louis. But that's a story we'll go into another time. Now, let's see, yeah. Now, Glass signed on in St. Louis for General Ashley's expedition up the Missouri River. I'll talk a little bit more about General Ashley and his expedition later, but on that expedition, they encountered the Arikara tribe near the upper bend of the Missouri River. Now, the Arikara tribe had built a makeshift fort out of dirt and wood palisades, and it was their form of a trading post where they took tolls on passerbys, other Native Americans, trappers, etc. So, after a day of trading, gift giving, etc., General Ashley and his men acquired some horses. Now, once they got these horses, they planned to split the group up. One group would go continue up to the Rockies through the Missouri River, and the other group would take the horses. But after being warned by another Arikara that the rest of the tribe was planning to attack, the mountain men dug in for the night. And it was early that following morning that the Arikara tribe attacked the mountain men. And after a fierce battle, where the mountain men barely escaped to their boats, and losing 14 men with 11 injured, and losing all of their horses, they just barely managed to get to their keel boats and row back up the river. After a few more engagements with the Arikara, General Ashley and his business partner, Andrew Henry, decided to take an overland route, abandon their keel boats to try to avoid being detected. So they split into two separate groups, one led by Andrew Henry and the other one led by Ashley himself. Now, Hugh Glass was a hired hunter, so his job was to go ahead of the group, hunt for deer, hunt for elk, whatever they are. And it was why he was all by himself, hunting off in the distance. He came across a mother grizzly. He had made the unfortunate mistake of getting between the mother grizzly and her two cubs. Now, the grizzly charged Glass and mauled him, and it was only the screams and the rifle shot that rang out in the woods that drew his compatriots to him. They were able to drive the mother grizzly away and drive the cubs away. But Glass was laying on the ground, half torn apart, and wasn't even able to stand, let alone talk. They patched him up as best they could, and Andrew Henry believed that he wouldn't live past the morning, so they waited the night. Well, he survived. So they figured, well, we'll wait another night. He'll surely die this next time. He didn't die again. So they made a makeshift gurney, and they dragged Glass over rock continually up into the Rockies. After 5 days of dragging him, half unconscious, not able to speak, they decided that there was no time to do this. They still had the Arikara on their tail. So Andrew Henry decided that they would leave Glass behind, and he will leave 2 men with him. Now, these both men got an $80 bonus for staying behind with Glass, so we had some willing volunteers. The first was an older woodsman named John Fitzgerald, and then it was a younger man between the ages of 17 and 18, that some accounts claim to be a young Jim Bridger. After 5 days, Glass was still alive, although only signs were faint breathing and twitching of the eyes. Out of fear of patrolling natives, Fitzgerald convinced Bridger that they had done their job. He's going to die anyway. Why should we get killed as well? So they took Glass's gun, his knife, his tomahawk, his fire-making kit, and they figured he's going to die anyway. No point letting this stuff go to waste. A few days later, Glass woke up, looked around, noticed they were all gone. And he had nothing to him except for a few bandages wrapped around his mangled body. And he knew the only source of salvation was Fort Kiowa. 200 to 300 miles away. Due to his injuries, he was only able to crawl for the first week and a half. He was only surviving off of plants that he encountered and bugs that were on the plants. He got lucky by the second week, where as he was crawling, he came across some wolves that had killed a buffalo calf. So he waited till nightfall and crawled up towards the dead buffalo and ate the raw meat in order to survive. After a few more days, he finally gained enough strength to be able to stand on his own 2 feet, breaking a branch off of a fallen tree to use as a crutch. He continued on that way for many more days before he finally arrived at the Missouri River. There was some friendly Lakota who gave him a boat made out of deer hide, which he used that to then float himself down the river. And by mid-October of 1823, Glass limped into Fort Kiowa, traversing almost 300 miles with nothing more than bandages on his back and grit. After recovering, Glass went out to get revenge on these men who abandoned him. However, he found Jim Bridger, and realizing he was only 19, and he'd clearly been manipulated by Fitzgerald, he forgave Jim. And Jim, to that day, still recounted the stories of the time that Hugh Glass decided not to take his life after Jim abandoned his. But it wasn't until 1824 that Hugh Glass finally caught up with Fitzgerald. But Fitzgerald was now working for the U.S. Army as a guide. And Fitzgerald's commanding officer said, "He's U.S. property now. If you kill him, we're going to have to kill you." So the only consolation he got in return from that was his rifle and his fire-making kit and knife that Fitzgerald still had. And so he moved on with his life. And Glass continued to be a Rocky Mountain man for the next 10 years, till in the year of 1833, he got killed by the Arikara tribe with other trappers while they were trapping up there in upper Missouri again. Now, it might make you wonder, what motivates people to risk their lives like this through bears, hostile Native Americans, hostile white Americans? What would motivate people to do this? Well, in a very oversimplified way, it was a fashion trend. This little critter is the reason why Hugh Glass almost lost his life and had to crawl for miles. Now, beaver had long been a staple in Europe for fashion, dating all the way back to the 14th century. Beaver fur was known for superior felting qualities, and anyone who wanted to display their status would need to have a beaver felt hat. But by the 1500s, beaver populations had all been extinct in Europe, except for parts of Russia and Scandinavia. This was due to overhunting. So as a result of that, beaver prices went up. Kill off half the population makes, increases some stuff. So the Europeans looked across the ocean to find their beaver pelts. Now I will be passing this beaver pelt around so you guys can see what they're talking about. There. Now, early English and French and Dutch settlers would trade with Native Americans for beaver. In the case of the Dutch, the settlement of New Amsterdam, modern-day New York City, was originally founded with the intent of tapping into this beaver pelt trade. Now, one difference, though, between the trappers of the early 1800s to those in the 1600s and 1700s was while some Europeans trapped beaver, the majority would rely on Native Americans to do the actual work, the actual trapping, the actual skinning, and they would meet them halfway and trade with them at their own forts. Now, with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, President Jefferson sent Captain Lewis and Lieutenant Clark out west. And when they came back, they recounted stories about the wide amount of animals, the great fauna, great stuff. All people really cared about was the reports on the beaver populations, the large beaver populations. This led many Americans to see an opportunity in the West, an opportunity to make some money. By this point, the beaver populations in the East Coast had, much like Europe, been driven to near extinction. So, got to push west. And it is here that the mountain men, as we know them today, began to take shape. Rival companies such as the Missouri Fur Company under Manuel Lisa and the John Jacob Astor's Pacific Fur Company, later the American Fur Company, began hiring men to journey up into the Rocky Mountains in order to tap into this furry fortune. But a little something called the War of 1812 got in the way of that. Now rival companies such as the Hudson Bay Company and the American Fur Company were fighting over control of this land as opposed to competition in the beaver. But with the end of the war came a new start for the companies. So let's take a minute to examine the hats that these men risked their lives for. The fur hat by the early 19th century. So by the 1820s and 1830s, the beaver felt top hat was the hat of choice for any men claiming to be in style in all of Eastern America and Europe. Now, the beaver pelts increased in value with this popularity, ranging from $300 to $600 for a pack of 60 fine beaver pelts. This hat here is an example of what kind of hats they were looking for. Now, it's not beaver felt, because I am not a rich man, but I'll pass this around as well. But it's hard to believe that men would go up in the mountains, risk their lives day to day for beaver, for hats. And one of those expeditions was Ashley's 100 of 1823. See, I told you I'd get back to this. So this ad right here, to enterprising young men. This was posted throughout St. Louis in 1822. William Ashley and his partner Andrew Henry took out ads in every major newspaper in St. Louis. Their goal? To draw in as many trappers and adventurers to come with them up to the mountains. Hugh Glass was one of those trappers who was drawn in by this advertisement. Now, they formed what's called the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. And up to this point, companies would trade with natives and lone trappers at forts and settlements. But Ashley and Henry had a different idea. They had the idea of they would hire 100 trappers, supply them with all the goods they need to trap, ammo, traps, you name it. Then, as payment, the men got to keep half of the furs that they trapped, and then the other half they got to sell back to the company at market price. Sounds like a pretty good deal. Besides Glass, many other famous mountain men got their start as part of William Ashley's 100 men. These included Jedediah Smith, Thomas Fitzpatrick, not to be confused with Fitzgerald, William Sublette, Jim Bridger, and James Kleiman, just to name a few. And after initial setbacks and a failed run for governor of Missouri in 1824, which, if you're interested in that crazy story, frontier history, read about Ashley's run for governor, Ashley found a better way to get the supplies to the men and the beaver to Europe. And that's what led us to the first rendezvous of 1825. So after a grueling expedition between November of 1824 to April of 1825, Ashley and his men were hauling supplies up to the remaining trappers with the intent of bringing them back to St. Louis, and bringing back all the furs. But the trappers didn't want to go. They decided that they would like to stay in the mountains. Up to this point, what would happen is trappers would go up with the supply train, stay up in the mountains for a year, and come back to St. Louis with the supply train again to deliver the pelts. But Ashley and his trappers came with the idea of, what if we keep the trappers in the mountains longer? So they started the yearly rendezvous. So what this was, is the mountain men would come to a predestination location in the mountains where all the companies would come to the same location. So the trappers would never have to leave the mountains, and in theory, could trap more and make more money. Now, there's one major problem for the poor trapper in this situation. Their only source of supplies is the companies now. So this became a very, very profitable system for the fur companies. So what happened was the companies would begin charging what was called mountain prices. So these were prices that could be 100% markup what the prices were in St. Louis. Think about it this way. You show up to the rendezvous. You need powder, you need lead, you need shot. Well, there's only one company here selling it, and unless I want to trek hundreds of miles to get to St. Louis to find someone selling it for cheaper, I got to buy with their price. Now this system would last for the next 15 years. Now, the rendezvous itself was held at various locations, all throughout Wyoming and Utah. Some of them crossing into Mexican territory at the time, with the Mexican-American border going all the way up to modern-day Wyoming-Utah border. The rendezvous became a place for men to socialize and share many a tall tale. Tales from their past years. Being able to tell a good story became an art form in the mountains. And many adventurers, such as Jim Bridger, inflated their egos, and many of their tales that we know and tell today are probably just tall tales they told around a fire to impress some friends. Now, those who could read would often purchase books at the yearly rendezvous, and they would bring those back to the campfire and sit around and read them to the rest of the men. Now, one thing that's very interesting is mountain men at this time who could read were surprisingly well versed. Looking at trade inventories, you see books that were brought to the mountains such as Shakespeare, Byron, and Plato. So it's hard to believe seeing a man clad in buckskin like me sitting there next to the fire recounting Hamlet to the men around him. And the rendezvous wasn't just about selling your pelts. It wasn't just about getting supplies. It was a social gathering at the end of the day. Picture this. You spend a whole year up in the mountains, camping, roughing it in stuff, a bed, a buffalo hide, and a few blankets like that, with 2 or 3 other guys for a year. And then you come to a rendezvous where you've got hundreds of guys all at the same time, all these activities going on. Yeah, it's going to be a huge party. So rendezvous would last up to a month at a time, and this provided a safe place for men to drink, gamble, get a good night's sleep, and all other things. Think about it this way. You just spent the last year half sleeping the whole time. You never know, every break of a branch startles you awake. You're ready for, at a moment's notice, is that a bear? Is that a coyote? What is it? But here in this large group of men, you have a sense of safety. You can finally sleep without having to think, I might not wake up after this. So, there were many activities at the rendezvous, aside from just trapping and trading. The mountain men did things such as horse racing, rifle shoots, tomahawk and knife throwing competitions, trap setting, fire starting, cards and dice, and much, much more. Many mountain men would burn through all the money that they had earned after a year of sales on drinking and gambling away. Many of them only had just enough money to buy the supplies they need to trap the following year. And that was only the ones who were smart enough to set the money aside. Now, I keep saying these mountain men, the mountain men this, the mountain men that. Well, who were the mountain men? Who were these people? Hollywood would have you kind of believe that it's just white Anglo-Americans who are going west, and it's just white Anglo-Americans alongside Native Americans, the whole thing. But it was a much more diverse group of men than that. The mountains came from many walks of life, races, and ethnicities. They were a mix of Anglo-Americans, French Canadians and French Americans, Europeans, Hispanics, and Eastern Native Americans, such as the Iroquois in Delaware, who, after the decline of the beaver trade in the East, would travel west to continue trapping and trading. This frontier of diversity led to a unique mountain culture, where abilities like speaking multiple languages like French and Spanish and other Native American languages, including plain sign languages, became more important than being able to shoot your rifle straight. This is in part because if you could communicate with someone, relationships could be built, trust could be formed, trading could go smoother, and a tense situation that could lead to a fight could be talked down through a simple hand motion. Many men who came out west came in their teens, and fewer still remained in the mountains after their first month, let alone their first year. These men not only had to learn wilderness skills quickly, but they had to learn to think carefully and critically. A mountain man who rushed to every fight that he could see was not a mountain man who lived long in the mountains. Now, money was a large pull for many of these men coming to the Rockies, with the high price of beaver pelt gave the allure of easy wealth. But many came seeking adventure, freedom, excitement. And at the end of the day, it was easier to get those things than it was to get the money. So one Hollywood trope is that about mountain men is that they were truly independent, just a trapper and his horse and his hawk and rifle and nothing else. No, that's kind of true. You had a few free trappers who didn't work for any company, and they trapped and traded on their own and then sold to the highest bidder. But that wasn't your average mountain man. Your average mountain man worked for a company. And as for working for the company, they trapped in brigades. Now, these brigades typically contain anywhere between 30, 50, to the largest brigades, 100 men. Once they arrived at an area they intended to hunt, they'd break into smaller groups. These smaller groups would branch out in the area. And then those smaller groups would break off into even smaller groups of 2 to 3 men. And these 2 to 3 men will go out and trap in different streams for a few days before returning to the larger group. Many of the greenhorns, otherwise known as the new men of the mountains, would tend to the camp while the experienced trappers and hunters will go out and trap and hunt for the day. The greenhorns had the unlucky job of having to cook, clean, take care of the pack animals, tan the hides that the trappers brought back in, and tear down and set up the camp. All part of their education is what it was called. All the while, the experienced hunters will go out in search of game, while experienced trappers will go out and trap beaver. Now, let's talk a little bit more about trapping beaver itself. I got here with me a few traps. Now, a beaver trap would have been a bit bigger than this. This would be more for like a muskrat or stuff like that, but the same concept is here. So, trapping beaver. Once a trapper found signs of beavers in a river, they'll go kind of a little distance away and kind of scout out a perfect spot to set his trap. Then, the trapper would walk back downstream away from the location, kick his moccasins off, and wade into the water. Why wade in the water? Up in the Rocky Mountains, frigid cold water. Well, I heard that. It was because of the smell. If a beaver smelled you, it wouldn't go anywhere near your trap. So walking through the water acted as a form of camouflage. So the trapper had to walk back to the spot he spotted out and try to be careful not to touch any of the brush along the side of the river. Once they arrived at their spot, they take your trap and they make a little bed for the trap, just there under the water. They'd set the trap just about 4 inches below the surface of the water, taking the chain and extending it down into deeper water where it dropped off, where they wedged a stake into it, usually a branch, and if they had a metal stake, they'd use that. Now, setting a trap, pretty simple. You push down on it, lower the jaws. Ooh. And you're good to go. Keep in mind, they're doing that in cold water. Now, what would happen is then they take a stick. They'd use that stick and they take and put their beaver bait on it. What's the beaver bait, you'd ask? What they'd use was called castoreum. Now, this came from a male beaver's castor gland, and it was used by the beavers to mark their territory. So what they would do is they'd run that all onto the stick, wedge that into the ground above the water, just hanging over the trap, and the idea was beavers are very territorial animals. So when they smell a rival beaver's castor, they'll come to investigate. Who's in my territory? What's going on here? So once this is all done, the trapper would wade back out the way he came and wait. The beaver would swim in from deeper water, kind of like the picture there, and come up to the bait. The beaver would use its front paws to push up off of the bottom of the water to get a better smell. And in doing that, he put his front paws down onto the trap. The beaver, being startled, would dive into deeper water to get away from whatever the threat was. The heavy metal trap would drag the beaver back down, drowning the beaver. Not the most humane way of doing it, but a reminder is you want the pelt. So shooting the beaver damages your pelt. That costs you money. And if you want more money, you got to do it a little cruel, I guess. Now, once this was done, the beaver would come back the following morning and check all of its traps, take the beaver out, and then begin to shave the beaver and skin the beaver. Now, by 1840, the rendezvous itself came to an end. So by the late 1830s, the writing was on the wall for the fur trade. Beaver felt hats were losing their popularity in favor of silk hats. And the market for beaver pelts was steadily declining. Prices were dropping, and the cost for supplies were increasing. Many companies like the Rocky Mountain Fur Company had been bought out by the large American Fur Company. And in 1840, the last rendezvous was held. It had such a small turnout of suppliers and trappers that they decided it wasn't even worth scheduling the next rendezvous. Some mountain men continued trapping, and then they'd go to frontier forts to sell their beaver pelts, kind of clinging on to that, this is my way of life, there's gotta be a way I can continue making a living. But many more saw the writing on the wall, and they began to find jobs as guides, guiding military expeditions, guiding settlers moving out west to Oregon and to California. So now we got some of the context out of the way. Now we're gonna get to the more the meat and potatoes of it, the clothing, the equipment, the gear of the mountain men. So now we're going to get into more of the clothing. When a greenhorn came to the mountain, he often came with whatever clothes he had in everyday life. Those would often include a pair of high-waisted pants like this. And they had a tie string in the back there to cinch them up. I'll pass these around too. See, I'm making you work today. And then they would have typically a white cotton shirt, like so. See, I told you. And then a lot of times, if they were wealthy enough, they might have had a vest. Now, vests were very popular in the mountains because it kept you warmer. It was a nice source of heat. There we go. But one problem with these clothes, most of them are cotton, some are wool, but the issue being is this isn't really able to survive in the rough weather and rough environment that is the Rocky Mountains. Climbing up cliff facings, walking through underbrush, they tear, they fall apart, they wear out. So, mountain men had to make do. They had to find new clothing. And that's where you get outfits more like this. Mountain men turned to the Native Americans for ideas on how to overcome this. So that's where you get things such as buckskin. Now, buckskin is not comfortable. It is cold when it's cold, it's hot when it's hot, and it's all around just uncomfortable. But it's strong. It can take a punch. Mosquitoes cannot bite through it. I learned that the great way. I was about to say hard way. It wasn't a hard way. It was a wonderful experience. Now, buckskins was a thing that had been used in the eastern United States, but mountain men adopted it from the Western Native Americans. So, one difference though. Now, most Western tribes, they would do what's called leggings that would go up to about here and would attach onto a belt. And then they would do a wool breechcloth that would kind of cover private spots. But mountain men weren't really fans of that. So, if you notice my pants, or in a similar style to those pants that are going around right now. They use Native American materials, but fashioned them in Eastern American styles by keeping the full pants like this. Now, shirts were also important on the frontier. They would often wear cotton or wool shirts like this that were just simple pullover design, with the more popular colors being red, green, and yellow. The idea of thinking at this time is camouflage isn't really a thing you're looking for. It's about status, show off. These are a bunch of guys who tell tall tales around campfires. You want to have a presence. Now, another thing that you could have seen on the frontier were Jefferson boots. These style of boots were made popular by Thomas Jefferson, who was the first president to wear non-buckled shoes in his inaugural speech. So these type of shoes became very popular by working class men in the 1820s and 30s, and were used significantly out in the West. Then these are also a very fast buy at the local rendezvous. I'll pass one around, I don't think we need both. And those type of shoes were great for walking around in the mountains, but those, like the clothes, would wear out over time. So as a result, you have moccasins. Much like the buckskin pants, men would adopt Native American moccasin styles. And much like buckskin pants, they're not comfortable. They're not great. But they're easy to make. They're easy to repair. you can pack a few of them in your kit. The idea being they are easily to replace, and usually when they got back to a rendezvous, they would purchase some shoes. Now, for headwear, they would often wear felt hats similar to mine here, which they would decorate however they please, feathers, whatever have you. Some men would put their smoking pipes up in the hat band so they wouldn't lose it. Other forms of hats that they would have used were, in the case that they lost their hat, they would cut a piece off of an old wool blanket and kind of wrap it around their head just to have something to protect their neck from the sun. In colder climates, they would wear fur hats. Fur like this, or ones with the animal's face on it, stuff like that. Or they wear what we call modern day a stocking cap, what at the time was called a Monmouth cap. And these were knit caps like this that were great for the winter weather. Right, there we go. I'm clearing my table off here. I'm liking that. So speaking of shirts again, now again, you probably remember thinking, hey, he said those cotton shirts wear out. Like, you're right. So why would they buy more? Comfort and fashion. These cotton shirts were easy to get a hold of, and a lot of them were brought to in trade inventories to the rendezvous. So the mountain men would often buy 5 pairs at a time in order to cycle throughout the year. But in the off chance that you lost all of your gear, which happened more times than you think, you'd have buckskin shirts like this. Now, mountain men did not really care for wearing buckskin shirts. This was more of a Native American style, and it was a last resort thing when you have your cotton shirts have worn out or you've lost all of them. So I'll pass this around so you can get an idea for what buckskin feels like, because I don't plan on taking my pants off. Now, speaking of shirts, we have wool shirts. You'll notice something about this shirt. It's a lot bigger than the one that I have on. The idea being this can be pulled on over top of the shirt and clothes that you already have. Something that can kind of provide extra warmth in the Rocky Mountains. Something that I often forget while camping here in Iowa is how cold it really can get, even in the summer months, when you're above at such a high altitude in the mountains. Like that. So there you go. Speaking of warmth, wool is a very important part for that. So we have what were called blanket coats, wool capotes. Now these were made in Eastern styles, and what we would do is they were big, made out of old blankets that you could throw on over top of all of your gear. Some of them had simple strings to tie them shut, or other ones similar to that of a bathrobe. You simply tie yourself off. And just like that, I have a coat that will protect me from rain and from the wind, and it's a blanket. So at night I can wrap myself up in it or wear it to bed and have extra warmth. One thing you learn from reenacting mountain men and using period gear to camp is wool is your best friend at night. Now another form of coat that they would have worn was the frock coat. Now these were seen back in the 1700s as well, and they slowly made their way out west. Frock coats like this weren't as warm as a wool coat, but they were good for the fall weather and stuff like spring. And so similar style, they follow European and Eastern American, and they'd be again a pullover. You pull this coat over top to kind of give you some form of protection. And a lot of times they would wear them open like this, have their items still easily accessible on the back. I think this will be one of my last things I'll hand you, so I'll give you a break for a while. All right. Now we're going to start talking a bit about food of the mountain men. I'm going to be honest with you, it's not that great. The mountain man's diet was mundane, and that's a really not easy way of saying it. The primary food source was buffalo and any other meat they could get their hands on, such as mountain rams, deer, elk, and even beaver tail and beaver meat. Okay, maybe this will be the last one. So, as your preface, the meat's not on that one, so got hungry before the show. So they would use, get there. The camps of the mountain men would have been pretty bare bones. The meat they ate had no seasoning. The only seasoning that you would have gotten up in the mountains was salt, if that. And all it was you take the meat and you cook it. As you can see in my little camp set up there, I'll click this off so I don't make it yellow. You'd either be taking your meat and sticking on just a simple branch and holding it over top the fire to cook it, or some would be fortunate enough to have a folding iron skillet like this, with a folding handle for easy packing, and it's a hollow handle. The idea being you can ram a stick in the end of it in order to cook your meat. Now, mountain men would usually have one of these for the 2 to 3 trapping group that go out. Same with the tripod there. What I have right there is what's called a trade kettle. And a trade kettle was basically just a sheet metal pot that mountain men would use to cook coffee, we used to boil water, and boil food. So usually they'd have about one of those per 5 men, give or take, 3 or 4, depending. And that would be what they'd use to feed all of them, including the pan. And you're probably wondering yourself, how did you start that fire? Well, mountain men didn't have matches. Matches didn't get invented until the mid-1830s, and by then, they weren't exactly popular on the frontier, let alone available on the frontier, because of their expensiveness. So mountain men would carry little tins like this. Now this tin's got 2 holes poked in the top of it, and what you do is you take cotton, say from your ripped clothes that have fallen apart, cut it up into small pieces, and you take the cotton and put it all into the thing. Once you start a fire, then you stick this tin into the fire, let it sit for 30 minutes. Leave it for too long, you'll destroy all your cotton. Leave it for too short, you destroy all your cotton again. Once you take it out, you let it cool till it's completely cold enough that you can grab it by your hand, and it'll turn into what's called char cloth, where the cotton's not fully burned, but charred, making it catch a spark really easily. Now that you have that, I won't actually light one though. I'm sure they probably wouldn't appreciate that. You'd use your flint and steel in order to light your fire. So you take your steel, and run it kind of in your knuckle like that, take your flint, and strike like that. And you see the sparks coming there. Take only one of those sparks to catch onto the char cloth, and then it'll start getting a little tinder to it. Then you take dried grass that you can find around, or any other dry material, and wrap it up into what looks like a bird's nest. You set the little piece of char cloth into it, wrap it up, and blow into it to get it nice and hot, and keep blowing until it sparks up into fire. Now, nothing more satisfying than lighting your fire with a flint and steel like this, at least in my experience. My issue is I did it one time and forgot to actually have the firewood and everything ready. So I got excited about the fire in my hand and realized, oh, there's nowhere to put it. So, something the mountain men were a little bit more acquainted with than I was. Now, to preserve meat, salt became an important commodity. It was often stored in small salt horns like this. Now, salt could be found at natural occurring salt deposits in the Rockies. So men would go about and collect the salt from there and use it to salt their deer hides, animal hides, what have you, and meats, so they'd be not going to rot and available to travel. So I'll pass this around. Not as dirty as the char cloth. Coffee was also a favorite amongst the mountain men. Now they didn't get it in grains like we do today. They got it in beans that they would buy at a rendezvous. Now a coffee grinder down there might have been used by mountain men to churn up their coffee. But in most cases, if they didn't have one, the back of their tomahawk would do, where they bash up the beans and then mash them up and put them in the pot. Now one thing that you should know, they didn't have coffee filters back then. So the coffee was poured directly into the boiling hot water. Then you take the water off the fire and let it cool for a bit. Then put it back on the fire again for a little longer. And then when you're ready, you pour cold water on it. The cold water makes the grains settle to the bottom. And if you're still struggling with grains, they take their tray kettle like that, put the lid on it, hold it by the handle, and spin it around as fast as they can like this. The idea being the force would make the heavier coffee grains sink to the back of the coffee pot, while the water with the coffee in it would come forward. So it would get you as close to not grainy coffee as you can. Now, this right here is what we call pretty bare bones campsite, but it would be the most typical campsite that a mountain man could get. If they had a piece of canvas, oh, they surely would have used it. It would have made a kind of makeshift shelter out of branches and stuff like that. But in the absence of canvas, they would have taken what animal hides they had, and sometimes they would tie them together to form a tent out of animal hides. Keep in mind, animal hides aren't as valuable today as they were back then as they were today. You can go out, shoot a few elk, skin them quick, and for an overnight stay, set up a tent between two trees with them. Same with buffalo. Buffalo were abundant in the West at the time, so they had no problem going out and shooting a couple buffalo just to tie them up and use them as a tent. But when you didn't have time to make a tent or weren't going to need it for a full, long period of time, they make a simple bedroll like this. And all it is you take a big buffalo hide, lay it down on the ground, and then you take, most mountain men would carry what's called a Hudson Bay blanket, and that's this big bread blanket right here, and that's a thick wool blanket. They lay that on top of the bison hide, and then they take other wool blankets like this that were their saddle blankets. Most mountain men had 1 to 2 horses, so they had about 1 to 2 saddle blankets. So they take those off their horses, wrap them up in there, and then they'd roll themselves up into the hide, into the wool blankets. Set themselves up nice by the fire, and that's their night. Their pillow being the saddle they just took off their horse. I can tell you, it's not the most comfortable night's sleep you'll get. Now we'll talk a little bit more about the weapons the mountain men used. Tomahawks were a common weapon and tool on the frontier. They could be used from anything between chopping up branches to fighting. So you had different styles of tomahawks. Styles like this, that had the heart shape in them, the different aesthetic choices that were made. Now, the nice thing about tomahawks is they couldn't just be used for just chopping up sticks, but the back of the tomahawk could be used for driving wood stakes in for your little awning and tents. Very versatile tool on the frontier. Some even, like the French style here, designed with the pommel on the back of it for hammering. Another popular type of tomahawk at the time was the pipe hawk. Now, not good for most camp things, but it was primarily used for smoking. Now, trading at the time in the western Rockies was always preceded by smoking. As soon as a mountain man entered a Native American camp, it was customary for them to have a smoke. That doesn't even mean like a diplomatic conversation that they'd had, simply sit around and smoke. A customary thing to be welcomed in. That is, if it was a tribe they were welcomed into, which was not always the case. The next thing up was the knives. The most common knives carried by the mountain men, and their primary form of eating utensil, was a butcher knife like this. Pretty straightforward, simple wood handle, nothing too fancy. But it wasn't supposed to be fancy. The idea behind it was, it's a knife that you can use for everything. Skinning, eating, and fighting if it's your last resort. Many knives over time being used for years and years on time would go from a curve like this to a point like this. After years of sharpening and sharpening and sharpening, skinning deer after deer, they would eventually be formed into this. Now, another form of knife that was very popular on the frontier at this time was the beaver tail dagger, because of its shape. Now, this was a very popular trade item with Native Americans of the West. So companies like the Hudson Bay Company would have the blades manufactured in Sheffield, England, which they would then be shipped out west, where company men like the Hudson Bay Company, Northwest Company, etc., would take them and trade them with Native Americans for pelts. The Native Americans would put their own handles on them, like so. A way the company could save money is not selling them with the handles. So set that there. I won't be passing the knives around. Those are a little too... Now we're going to get to some of the firearms, such as this one. Now, pistols were very popular amongst mountain men, But not every mountain man was able to afford a pistol and a long gun. So pistols would have either come in a percussion cap like this or a flintlock style. I'll explain the ignition systems in a minute. But my point is with the pistol, a pistol was very popular because it was a great tool to have as a self-defense weapon at night and while you're tending to your traps. It's something that can be stuck into a belt while you're wading through the river, carrying your traps while your rifle's back on shore. Great for at night. You have a pack of wolves surrounding your camp. This pistol would be the only thing you have to protect yourself. You'd have your rifle, but things like this were nice in a pinch. Now, one thing that's interesting is mountain men's pistols were typically in the same caliber as their rifles. Now, why is this? Well, the reason is because it's not like today where you can just go to a gun store and buy ammunition. You didn't buy ammunition back then. You went to the rendezvous and you bought pure lead ingots. Now this is your ammunition for the year. So what you do is you cut a piece off of the lead and you take and hold it over top the fire. And every rifle that was sold, you would have gotten a ball mold like this. So you take the ball mold, once you have the lead piping hot and in a liquid state, you'd pour it into the mold where it would, and take it out of the fire where it would harden like that, and turn into a round ball, like that. So, not as easy as simply going to the store and just picking up some ammo. But the idea is that's a lot of work, and you have to do it one by one by one. So if your rifle and your pistol are two separate calibers, you have to have two different molds, and you have to do ammunition for both of them 2 separate times. So the idea of having them both the same caliber is the round balls that I have in here that I use for my rifle can be used in my pistol at the same time. So that's a little bit about why the pistols are like that. Now let's talk a little bit more about the rifles. I'll get to you in a minute. But we'll start with the most common rifle on the frontier, the Kentucky or Pennsylvania rifle. And I say or because both the states of Kentucky and Pennsylvania argue with who actually gets ownership of this rifle. So this is the type of rifle that was used throughout the American Revolution and before. And it's a very simple design. Long rifle, chambered in either 45 all the way up to 54 caliber, this one being a 50 caliber. And the way it works, I'll give you a little context about it too. Rifles like this could hit anywhere between 150 to 300 yards for their max range. Now a lot of that has to do with the shooter as well, how well trained you are with it, and the correct amount of powder load you have. One thing about muzzle-loading rifles that distinguishes them a lot from modern guns is it's not as simple as just putting a bullet in and firing, and that's going to be 150 to 200 yards. You need to figure out the load for your rifle. Each one is different. Each one takes time to learn, oh, this many grains of powder works better, this one works better. Now I'll go over how these things are actually loaded. So first things first, you pull this hammer here to half cock, this one being a flintlock rifle, meaning in this jaws here, you have a piece of flint. Remember from the flint and steel before, same concept. It's a little rock piece of flint. Now this here is steel. So it has a little pan here, which you would take, reach into your bag, and you pull out a little brass primer. And in here you would have fine grade powder, which you take and pour a little in there. It's empty right now, so don't worry, it won't be loud. Then you close that pan. Now that that's closed, you're ready to go to the muzzle. Drop the gun down. You take your powder out of your powder horn, open it up. Now, a lot of times it wasn't just simply pouring directly into the end of the barrel because that can be pretty chaotic. You could overload it. If you put too much powder into it, the gun could explode. And if you put too little, the ball would get stuck. So oftentimes they would figure out the amount of powder that worked best in their gun, and they'd fashion powder measures like this. This one's made out of an elk antler. So you'd pour the powder into the antler there, close up your powder horn, and pour it down into the end of the barrel. Now that that's ready, you take, some of them would have what's called a patch box at the end. Pop that open, and you reach in and pull a patch out, which is kind of a little cotton wadding. Pull that out, close it up, and you'll lay that over top of the muzzle, where you then take your round ball and set it in, jam it down with your thumb, then take your ball starter, tap it there, tap it down again, stick it back in, and then you get ramrod out and ram the ball home. The fastest time I've had with that is about a little over a minute. Now it's just to shoot once. So, now the gun's ready to fire. So just like the flint and steel before, the flint will then strike the steel, creating an ignition, which is just sparks flying out, which will hit the powder, ignite the powder, and fire the main charge. So when you're ready to fire, you pull it back to full cock, release the safety, and pull the trigger. The flint strikes the steel, creating sparks, which will land in the pan, igniting the powder, firing the gun. Now that's all fine and dandy, but what if it's raining? What if it's humid? Those are some things that can make a flintlock like this jam up and struggle. After you're shooting it multiple times, black powder is messy. All that smoke, it's all dirty. You gotta wipe it down a lot between shots on the inside here. Now, oftentimes you don't have to wipe the barrel down in between shots. That's kind of an old wives' tale that people tell about black powder guns. That's not the case. Usually the patch is enough to kind of wipe down the barrel while you're reloading the gun. But yeah, this part will get fogged up a lot. And these were the backbone of the Rocky Mountain fur trade and the rifles used by mountain men and frontiersmen for the longest time. But it wasn't the only one. You also had guns like this. This one's called the Northwest Trade Gun. As you can see, it's got a beautiful emblem of a serpent on the side of it. Now, if you want to look at any of these guns closer up afterwards, you're more than welcome to come up and I'll show them all to you a little closer up. Now these were manufactured in Britain and the plant were sold to the Hudson Bay Company, Northwest Company. Now these started being made in the 1790s and they're built with a 62 caliber, which is that round ball I showed you earlier. So about that size of a round ball shoots out of them, which is a 20 gauge shotgun. So these were completely smooth bore as opposed to the rifles. Rifling meaning that they have grooves inside the barrels. So when the ball is rammed down and fired, the grooves would give the ball a spin, and the spin would increase their distance and accuracy. These don't have that. It's just a metal pipe shooting it out, so it won't have any spin. So their max range, accurately, is between 50 and 100 yards. Really good shooter could probably get it up to 150 with the right loads. But these were more popular amongst Native Americans. And they were given to greenhorns who couldn't afford a rifle. Now, why were they more popular, you wonder? Because of the versatility. A smooth bore like this could not only shoot a round ball out, but it could shoot buckshot out of it. So now you have a gun that has a large enough caliber that you could take down most big game in the western frontier, and you can use it for hunting birds, ducks, small game. So for Native Americans, why would I have a rifle that's limited and I can only shoot more large game, or I can have a gun that can do both? So that's what made it more popular amongst them. And it used the exact same system. Pour the powder in there, pull the flintlock back, create a spark and fire. Exact same mechanism. And these were very popular in the West because of that. Now for the gun that most people associate with mountain men. And that right here is the Hawken rifle. One glaring difference it has between that long rifle we showed before is it's a lot shorter, and it's only got a half stock. The idea behind this one was you want a rifle that you can better navigate the woods, better navigate the mountains in. That long rifle's great, but walking around in the woods, it bangs up against everything. So a shorter rifle that was still a big enough caliber to take down most large game. So these would range between 45 to 58 caliber. Now, one distinct difference about them is their ignition system itself. They were invented by this type of gun was invented by the Hawken brothers in 1825 in St. Louis. And they tapped into the new type of percussion cap ignition system. So, as we shown before with a flintlock, you pull the hammer back, you pour the powder, drop the pan down. Not so with this one. You pull the hammer back, and you take a capper. In each one of these, be a little orange cap that would create its own self-contained explosion. It'd go onto the end of the nipple there, and then the same thing would be all done at the top. You pour the powder, pour all that. But now you didn't have to worry about sparking just right. So it might be a little loud, then the hammer gets pulled, it ignites the cap. One pro of this is this works in the rain. This works in high humidity. This works in all-around situations like that. But it didn't catch on right away in the mountains. It wasn't until the mid to late 1830s that it started to catch on. Two reasons. One, this is a very new ignition system. It was expensive to produce. They were very expensive rifles, and only the most wealthy of mountain men could afford them. And as we said before with drinking and gambling, there wasn't too many wealthy mountain men. So by the late 1830s, these became more popular. One other issue is mountain men figured, why would I want a gun where now I don't only have to buy lead and powder at the rendezvous, now I have to buy these newfangled caps as well? These tiny things that I can just drop and lose if I don't have these cappers that they sell as well on top of it. They figure, well, why would I do that when I could just use my flintlock, buy powder and lead, and I can use the powder for both? Eventually, the pros outweighed the cons, and this type of gun overtook by the late 1830s. That's enough about guns for now. So, in conclusion, this only scratches the surface of what life was like for the mountain men. But their impact on the West was substantial. Most famous mountain men like Jedediah Smith and James Beckwourth discovered routes through the mountains that would open up westward migration for years to come. As I said, many would go on to guide settlers moving west and would use their first-hand knowledge of the Rockies to help government expeditions map out the Rockies. But why we should be interested in the mountain men outside of their impact on Western expansion? For me, there are two takeaways I get from studying the mountain men. The first being the call to adventure. I've said it before, like, it may sound terrible to some of you to wrap yourself in a buffalo hide and sleep out in the snow, but for me, that's a dream. I love it. Reenacting the fur trade, I have been able to test my resolve against the elements with limited luxury, and doing so gave me a sense of freedom that you can only really experience in nature. Something that you read about in journals and stuff from mountain men, talking about how they got to escape civilized life and the stresses of social pressure and all that, just to do the simple things, survival. And the second thing I believe we can learn from the era is the cultural exchange. It's no secret the 1820s and 1830s weren't exactly progressive times. But when it came to the race and cultural differences, but in the mountains, people from various races, ethnicities, were brought together by a common economic goal, the beaver. And through a shared experience of survival in the Rockies, at the very worst, they were able to cooperate and tolerate each other for a time, just for the equal goal of survival. But in the very best, you had transitions of culture, had cultural exchanges. All this to say, you can spend many years learning about these explorers, and I encourage you all to learn more about their impactful generation of adventure. There are many more outstanding stories of survival and grit like that of Hugh Glass, and many more colorful characters that I could spend a whole day talking about. But I'll save those for another time, and I'll open it up to any questions you all might have. So thank you for coming out tonight.
What do you cut the bullet stuff with?
Yeah, so lead's actually a soft metal, which is part of why lead became so popular to use for these type of weapons. So you could take your axe or a rock and just cut it open like that. That's part of another thing that they would do is if they wanted to get their ball more rounded than outside of the mold, they'd stick it in their mouth and swaddle it around kind of like a jawbreaker to get it nice and right. That's one historical thing I haven't tried yet, and I don't think I plan to. Yeah. Yes.
The buckskin shirt has the fringe on it. Does that have any practical?
Yes, good question. So fringe, some experts have thought that the idea behind fringe was when it rains, the fringe would draw the water away from the base of your leg and chest. But over experimentation from experimental archaeology and other experts, they found that that doesn't really work. And at the end of the day, it's more of a aesthetic choice by many tribes of the West. So it's not really more for any function, more for aesthetically. And the one function that you can give it is, say you're working on your structure, your tent, or whatever shelter you have. You need to tie something off quick. Well, you got all this string right here you can cut off and tie off. That's probably the closest to practical use, like outside of just for aesthetic looks that they had. There's been experiments with the water technique of like, does it really draw water away? Not really, a little. So it's more just a Native American fashion trend that the mountain men adopted. Yes.
When I first went out west, a guy who did taxidermy for me, I would go over there, and he was a modern mountain man, but never used a tent.
Mm-hmm.
In the winter, made a snow cave, would make a wiki up, with his branches. So one day I go there, and he has a bunch of Boy Scouts there. They're tanning hide.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did is they used the brains of the deer, and they rubbed that on there to keep it supple.
Yeah.
And all the boys were there with the brain on their hands and just rubbing on that, and that's how you got it.
Yes, yep, that's how they tanned their hides. You didn't have Trapper Solution, you could just go to Walmart and pick up. Any other questions? Yes.
What was the age range of most of the mountaineers?
Yeah, so typically they were in their late teens to mid to late 20s was kind of their range. You had some who were in their 30s. For example, Hugh Glass would have been about 36 in 1823 when he went up to the mountains. And on average, it was your 20s and 30s were the ones who were like the more veteran mountain men in the area. That being said, there was stories of an 80-year-old mountain man who was a frontiersman out east, and then the frontier moved, so he decided to move with it. So you have outliers like that. For on average, it's more like teenagers coming out west in their early 20s, and then they kind of grew up in the mountains, became more experienced. So 20s and 30s is your more range there. Yes?
Why don't you tell them to share with them what you've been learning? What have you been doing recently, new skills?
Yeah, so I've actually started tanning deer hide myself to kind of get in that feel for it. And one thing that's nice about deer hide is it does make for great clothing like this. For example, items like this, I've made myself by hand through just working on deer hide. And some things that you can kind of learn, done is I'm working on doing more backpacking and trekking, as we call it. So trekking means is you take period equipment, so like your rifle, your pack, and only things that you'd have on you are the things that you can carry that would have been period documented to the 1820s and 30s. So for example, all of the things that would be in my possibles bag here would have been things I could find, like my tin cup, extra rope, a wood spoon, that kind of stuff. And I would go out and basically do a backpacking trip, hiking up in the wilderness, and just sleep overnight. Now, one thing that's kind of makes it a little different between trekking and like actually doing it is one very period item that they all had that I just haven't been able to get. It's called a horse. So guys got to learn how to pick and choose what things he can carry on his back. I kind of found that there is a limit to how much you can pack into a knapsack. But yeah, those are just a few of the things I've been doing. My next goal is I plan to head out to the Black Hills someday and do a full-on backpack trip up Black Elk Peak in period mountain men clothing. So we'll see how my feet feel after moccasins walking up the peak. See, I hear that, but I'm excited, so. Yes?
A lot of the mountain men ended up marrying Indian women.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. Yeah, a lot of them would. So that's kind of part with the cultural exchange I talked about. A lot of mountain men would marry into tribes, and part of that being love being one reason for it, but a lot of it was due to like trade relations. They wanted a better relationship with tribes, and so they would marry into the tribe. One other activity, I guess you could say, at rendezvous was mountain men were very prideful of their wives and wanted to show off, like, look how beautiful my wife is. So a lot of times they burn their money buying the fanciest dresses for them to show all the other guys, like, look, I can afford this. I can really treat her with luxury. Look at the latest stuff I can buy for her. Then go back up the mountains broke. But yeah, that was a big thing about it. Yes?
Any history of mountain women?
Not really. So there was a lot of women active in the fur trade, but they were primarily mixed Native American white women and Native American full-blooded women. The first time that you had white women or who had ventured out was with some of the missionaries in the 1837 rendezvous who came. But you did have Hispanic women who were involved in the fur trade in New Mexico. And a lot of them did a lot of jobs from trading with the white trappers and stuff like that, and marrying into families and that sort of thing. But it wasn't directly like a mountain woman per se, but women did have a part to play within the fur trade itself. Yes?
Did they have soap?
No, they did not have soap. Soap was a thing at this time, but think about it this, it's a luxury that you have to pack, so a lot of them didn't. But that's not to say they didn't bathe. A lot of mountain men did bathe in rivers and stuff like that, but there's also journal entries where mountain men would bathe and come out and all their gear would be gone. So, you know, pick and choose. Do I smell a bit bad today, or do I keep all my stuff? Yes?
So you talked about going to the Black Hills. Now, what other areas have you gone to?
I've actually done some stuff around here. The Oak Ridge Park over in, yeah, I've done some backpacking there, just some small day trips where I set up as if I'm going to camp, but I don't think I'm allowed to camp there, especially with a rifle. But yeah, I've done some excursions like that. I do a lot of modern day rendezvous. So it's the same thing where we have a bunch of people get together once a year and basically recreate the Rocky Mountain fur trade. We had one just this past weekend I got in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, where it was about, I would say about 60 tents set up, people all dressed up in mountain men clothing and period camping and stuff like that. So those are some of the other excursions that I've done. Yeah, and in that I slept in just a little lean-to tent, which was not so much fun for the rain Saturday night.
Well, let's give Kaleb another round of applause. He did a wonderful job. Kind of give us an idea of what it was like back then and how, I mean, compared to what we're doing today?
Yeah. A bit different.
I'm glad you enjoy it. Well, I've just got a few more announcements. We'd like to remind you of the upcoming nights at the museum programs. Tuesday, July 9th, Jim Scott will present the Sukow, I always say that wrong, Sukow story. Ruth Sukow was a popular 20th century writer who was born in Hayward in Iowa. Jim and a cast of stars will present a reader's theater based on her story, A Great Molly. Then on Tuesday, August 13th, Andrew Klump will present Double Dutch, Dutch Immigrants as both settlers and missionaries. And Andrew is the editor of the Annals of Iowa and Education Publications Manager of the State Historical Society of Iowa and director of the Provisional Iowa Humanities Council. Then on finally on Tuesday, September 17th, Del Wallinga will share the antiquity of policing, and Del will illustrate the rich history of the development of law enforcement professions. So we have some good programs lined up. We're hoping that you'll be able to come and enjoy them as well. And one more thing, as you leave, take a look at all the Dutch American Heritage Museum merchandise that we have by the front table. We're using the proceeds from that merchandise to continue the funding of our museum here, as well as eventually we'd like to get some full-time, at least one full-time staff person so that we can keep the museum open more hours. So if you want to take a look at those and purchase some of that merchandise, that would be very helpful for us. So appreciate that. And also, if you're willing to volunteer, as we have some different projects from time to time that need a few more hands. If you're willing to volunteer, we can use additional volunteers, so talk to any of the board members and we'd like to take you on. So at that, let's give Kaleb another round of applause. I really enjoyed this. Thank you, and we'll see you next month.